A mason's hands move without stopping, chisel against stone again and again in a rhythm older than the city around him. The block in front of him is cold, grey, heavy, quarried far upstream and floated down on a barge that took weeks to arrive. He doesn't look up. There is always another block waiting. Around him, the scaffolding rises into a sky that offers no promises. Other men work in silence, not the silence of peace, the silence of men who have learned not to ask how much longer. A boy carries mortar that will not be used today. The foreman studies marks on a parchment no one fully understands anymore. Somewhere below, the city goes on. Merchants, fires, the smell of the river. Up here, seasons come and go, faces change, the stone does not. One morning, the work simply stops. No announcement, no ceremony. The treadwheel crane remains. The unfinished walls remain. And a question without an answer settles over Cologne like fog. It would stay that way for nearly 300 years. This is the story of Cologne Cathedral. In the summer of 1248, the old Cathedral of Cologne was gone. Not abandoned, not repurposed, consumed. The fire that tore through the Romanesque structure left no salvageable walls, no usable foundation, no symbolic continuity. What remained was a cleared site and the institutional memory of what had stood there. The city smelled of wet ash for weeks. Archbishop Conrad von Hochstaden did not treat the loss as a tragedy to be mourned. He treated it as an opening. Cologne at that moment held something that almost no other city in the Christian West possessed: the relics of the three Magi, the bones brought from Milan decades earlier, which had already transformed the city into one of the most visited pilgrimage destinations in Europe. Thousands arrived every year. They moved through Cologne's timber-framed streets, crossed its bridges, spent money in its markets, and then stood before a church that, by the standards of what was being built in France, was modest. The mismatch was functional, not just aesthetic. The Archbishop understood the logic precisely. A city that held the bones of the Magi needed a structure that matched the claim. Anything smaller would be a contradiction in stone. The decision to build a new cathedral was therefore not primarily a spiritual act. It was an institutional calculation, a statement about Cologne's rank in the hierarchy of Christian cities, about the volume of pilgrimage income the city expected to sustain, and about the ambitions of a church that had watched the great Gothic cathedrals of northern France rise over the previous century. Chartres had been rebuilt. Amiens was under construction. Reims was already reshaping what people understood a cathedral to be. Cologne was behind. The decision to build was also a decision to catch up. The man chosen to lead the project was Master Gerhard, an architect who had studied the French Gothic style at its source. He had seen the flying buttresses of Amiens, the vertical logic of Beauvais, the way the new French cathedrals seemed to dissolve their own walls into glass and air. He arrived in Cologne with a vocabulary of forms that the local workforce had never encountered. The heights he was planning required structural solutions that most German masons had never been asked to execute. The proportions were not simply larger versions of what they already knew. They were a different system entirely. The foundation stone was laid in August 1248. The machinery of construction began to move. What that machinery actually consisted of was almost entirely human. There were no cranes in the modern sense, no prefabricated components, no standardized material delivery system. There was the river, the mountain, and the body of men organized into guilds whose collective knowledge represented generations of accumulated technique. The stone chosen for the cathedral was trachyte, a volcanic rock quarried at the Drachenfels, the Dragon's Rock, a mountain roughly 25 miles south of Cologne along the Rhine. It was dense, workable, and durable. It was also heavy in a way that defined every logistical decision made over the following centuries. Each block had to be cut by hand from the mountain face, shaped into manageable dimensions on site, loaded onto barges, floated downriver, unloaded at Cologne's waterfront, and transported through the city streets to the construction site. A single shipment could take weeks. A winter storm could destroy a barge and send months of quarried stone to the bottom of the Rhine. There was no redundancy in this system. The guilds that operated at the site were structured around the transmission of knowledge rather than the execution of plans. Master Gerhard held the overall design in his head and on parchment. But the specific geometry of each carved element, the tracery windows, the ribbed vaults, the column capitals, lived in the hands and eyes of the master masons who had trained for decades to produce them. This knowledge was not written down in any form that a non-specialist could use. It existed as proportion, as muscle memory, as the ability to read a chalk line on a tracing floor and understand what shape it was asking for. When a master mason died, that knowledge died with him, unless it had been fully transferred. The workforce below the masters was fluid in ways that made any long-term planning extremely difficult. Laborers came from the surrounding region and were subject to the same agricultural calendar that governed every aspect of medieval life. During harvest season, the site lost significant portions of its unskilled labor. Men returned to their fields because starvation was a more immediate problem than cathedral construction. The church understood this. The schedule accommodated it because it had no choice. Work also stopped every winter. Mortar, the critical bonding agent for all masonry, could not be laid below certain temperatures. The lime-based mixtures used in the 13th century required warmth to cure properly. A wall laid in frost would not hold. The decision to continue anyway was not an option that existed. Every autumn, the site was prepared for suspension. Surfaces were covered, exposed joints were protected, scaffolding was secured. Every spring, the work resumed exactly where it had stopped, often discovering that frost had damaged sections that needed to be relaid. The cycle consumed months every year. This was not a flaw in the construction process. It was the construction process. The cathedral was, at its core, a machine for converting time into stone. And time was the one resource that operated on a completely different scale from every human life involved in the project. Master Gerhard's original design called for a structure of unprecedented ambition for German soil. The choir, the eastern section where the clergy performed the liturgy and where the relics of the Magi would be housed, was designed to a height that required engineering solutions at the outer limit of what 13th century Gothic technique could achieve. The flying buttresses that would carry the lateral thrust of the high vaults away from the walls were not decorative. They were structural logic made visible, a response to the problem of building higher than the walls themselves could support without collapsing outward. Each element of the design was contingent on the others. The height of the choir determined the span of the vaults, which determined the load on the buttresses, which determined the depth of the foundations, which had to be calculated before the first stone was laid. The entire structure was a system in equilibrium, and every component had to be executed to the specified dimensions, or the equilibrium broke. This created a dependency that had no parallel in any other type of construction at the time. A house could be modified as it was built. A city wall could be thickened or extended without compromising what already stood. A cathedral designed in the French High Gothic style could not. The geometry of the vaults locked every dimension in place before construction began. Master Gerhard's parchment plans were not suggestions. They were constraints that every subsequent master builder would be bound by, regardless of what technology or resources were available when they arrived at the site. The knowledge required to read those plans was not universal. It was specialized to a degree that made the project genuinely vulnerable to the death of individuals. When Master Gerhard himself died, the exact date is not recorded, his successor had to reconstruct an understanding of the design from the physical evidence of what had already been built and from whatever drawings survived. The transition was not seamless. It never was. By the end of the 13th century, the choir was nearing completion. The east end of the building, with its ambulatory, its radiating chapels and its soaring clerestory windows, was beginning to take the shape that Gerhard had designed. The city had poured resources into the project for 50 years and had a partial structure to show for it, extraordinary in its detail, incomplete in its function. The Magi's relics were installed in the unfinished choir in 1322. The pilgrims kept coming. The 14th century introduced pressures that the original planners could not have anticipated, because no one in 1248 had any mechanism for anticipating what the next 100 years would bring. The Black Death arrived in Cologne in 1349. It did not discriminate by skill level. The master masons who died in that period took with them geometrical knowledge that had taken decades to accumulate. The specific proportions used in the tracery windows, the curvature of the vaults, the system of templates used to cut the column capitals to their correct profile. Some of this knowledge was reconstructed from physical examination of the existing work. Some of it was approximated by the masons who survived. Some of it was simply lost. The construction did not stop during the plague years, but it slowed in ways that went beyond the simple loss of labor. The confidence with which a design could be extended, the certainty that the next section would match the proportions of the previous one, was compromised. The men who returned to the scaffolding after the worst of the epidemic had passed were working from incomplete understanding. Knowledge loss is irreversible in a way that labor loss is not. Beyond the immediate catastrophe of the plague, the broader economic conditions that had made the cathedral possible in 1248 were shifting. The trade routes that had given Cologne its commercial dominance were changing. The Hanseatic League was redirecting commerce in ways that reduced Cologne's share of the traffic. The pilgrimage income from the Magi relics remained significant, but it was no longer sufficient to fund construction at the pace the early decades had established. Funding a Gothic cathedral of this scale required a continuous and very large flow of money. Stone, skilled labor, transportation, scaffolding timber, tools, the administrative apparatus of the cathedral chapter. All of it had a cost that did not decrease simply because political or economic conditions became difficult. The cathedral consumed wealth at a constant rate. The wealth available to supply it was not constant. The construction slowed. Then it slowed further. By the mid-15th century, the rhythm that had defined the site for 200 years was breaking down. There were years in which almost no new masonry was laid. The workforce contracted to a fraction of what it had been at the peak. The scaffolding that covered portions of the unfinished nave began to weather in place rather than being repositioned as work advanced. The site was still active, but it was no longer building. The year 1560 did not announce itself as a turning point. There was no decision made, no formal declaration that construction was ending. The process was more gradual and more bureaucratic than that. Funds were simply not allocated. Workers were not hired for the season. The remaining master mason completed his last assignment and was not replaced. The treadwheel crane that sat atop the south tower's unfinished stump, a massive wooden mechanism that had been used to hoist stone and timber to the upper sections of the structure, remained where it was. It was too large and too embedded in the masonry to be easily removed. It stayed. Over the following decades, the crane became the most visible feature of Cologne's skyline. The city grew around the unfinished cathedral. New buildings rose in the streets below. The Rhine continued to carry commerce past the city's waterfront, and against the sky, the crane's wooden silhouette remained unchanged, a mechanism frozen in the position it had occupied when the last stone was set. It was not a monument. It was not preserved deliberately. It simply never came down. For nearly 3 centuries, the crane stood as the most accurate description of what had happened. A project suspended at the moment of its ambition, with the mechanism of its continuation still in place, but no longer in use. The Protestant Reformation had shifted the intellectual and political energy of Northern Europe away from the kind of institutional devotion that built cathedrals. The wars of religion consumed the wealth and attention of the German states for generations. The unfinished choir and the single tower stump were a physical record of a world that had reorganized itself around different priorities. The stone did not decay. The geometry did not become invalid. The original parchment plans had disappeared, to Paris, as it turned out, where they sat in an attic for centuries without anyone understanding what they were. The cathedral waited, not symbolically, physically. The walls that had been built were still sound. The foundations were intact. The choir functioned as a church. The structure that remained was not a ruin in any meaningful sense. It was a partial building, capable of completion, if the conditions for completion ever returned. Those conditions returned in the 19th century, but through a mechanism that the medieval builders could not have predicted: nationalism. The Romantic movement that swept through European intellectual culture in the early 1800s treated the Middle Ages not as a period of backwardness, but as the origin point of modern European identity. For German intellectuals and political figures trying to imagine a unified German nation, which did not yet exist as a political entity, the unfinished cathedral in Cologne became a powerful object. It was simultaneously a proof of medieval German ambition and a visible daily reminder of incompletion. The analogy to the fragmented German states was not subtle. The original 13th century facade plans were discovered in Paris in 1814, folded, water-stained but legible. Their recovery was treated as a sign. Here were the intentions of Master Gerhard, intact after 6 centuries, waiting to be executed. The Central Cathedral Building Society was founded in 1842, drawing members from across German society. Aristocrats, merchants, craftsmen, civic organizations. The Prussian state provided funding. The Cologne municipality contributed land and administrative support. For the first time since the medieval peak of construction, the cathedral had a reliable and politically secure source of income. The final phase of construction ran from 1842 to 1880. It operated in a world that looked nothing like the one that had begun the project. Steam-powered hoists replaced the tread-wheel crane for the heaviest lifting. Railway lines brought stone from the Drachenfels faster and more reliably than any barge system had ever managed. The administrative capacity to coordinate a large workforce across a multi-decade project had been formalized in ways that medieval guild structures could not match. Accurate technical drawings could be reproduced and distributed. Specifications could be enforced uniformly across a large workforce, and yet the final stones of Cologne Cathedral were still carved by hand. The decision was not sentimental. It was technical. The tracery of the windows, the profiles of the moldings, the carved decoration of the capitals. These elements had been designed for hand tools and for the kind of close visual inspection that a carver standing 6 inches from the stone performs. Machine cutting of the 19th century produced surfaces and edges of a different character. The difference was visible. The men completing the cathedral in the 1870s were matching work that had been done in the 1270s, and they did so using the same tools and the same process. The last capstone was set on the twin spires in October 1880. At that moment, the structure became the tallest building on Earth, a distinction it held for 4 years, until the Washington Monument was completed. What the completed cathedral represented, in purely structural terms, was the successful transmission of a set of geometric intentions across 6 centuries, 2 distinct historical periods, and at least a dozen separate construction campaigns carried out by men who had never met each other, and in many cases could not have communicated directly if they had. The parchment plans were the mechanism of that transmission, the one element of the original design that existed outside any individual human memory, and that survived the gaps between generations. The slowness was not accidental, and it was not a failure of will. It was the direct consequence of building at the edge of what available technology could achieve, in a system where the primary constraint was not money or labor, but the rate at which critical knowledge could be held, transferred, and rebuilt when it was lost. A cathedral built faster would have been a different building, lower, simpler, designed within margins that a workforce could execute, without the decades of accumulated expertise that the actual design required. The 6 centuries between the first stone and the last one were not empty. They were the price of the geometry.